All right, get ready because today we're diving deep into a case that'll send chills down your spine. We're talking about Robert Zarinsky, a convicted murderer with a possible, and I mean a really long list of victims. What's truly fascinating about this dive is that Zarinsky himself said he knew about, get this, up to 10 murders.
Wow. Yeah.
10
So
murders.
is this a killer just bragging, or did he die with a whole bunch of dark secrets? Well, that's exactly what we're here to try and figure out.
It's a fascinating case for sure, and definitely disturbing. Zarinsky flew under the radar for years, and even when he was locked up, his name kept popping up in unsolved murders. It makes you wonder, how many secrets can one person keep hidden? You know?
Right.
It's incredible.
So, to start, let's set the scene.
Yeah.
Zarinsky wasn't exactly a saint even before the murders began. What can you tell us about his early life? Anything that might hint at this dark path he went down?
Yeah.
Well, even before he was connected to any murders, Zarinsky had a history of small crimes, petty stuff, and he was in and out of psychiatric institutions. You could say it was a pattern, like his behavior was escalating.
So maybe those early incidents were like red flags, signs that something was seriously wrong. But let's fast forward now to 1969. This is when 17-year-old Rosemary Calandriello disappeared from Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey. This case is super important, right? I mean, it's the one that finally put Zarinsky behind bars, even though they never found her body.
Absolutely. This case was huge in New Jersey. It set a new standard. Zarinsky became the first person in the state convicted of murder, and get this, without a body ever being found.
That's incredible. It makes you wonder, what kind of evidence did they use to get a conviction without that key piece, the body?
Right.
It must have been incredibly difficult.
They had to build an airtight case, and it was all based on circumstantial evidence, witness testimonies, and Zarinsky's own words, which, by the way, were all over the place.
So no physical evidence to back anything up.
Think about it. They had to prove without a doubt that a murder happened, and that Zarinsky did it, all without a body. Like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
And on top of that, Zarinsky himself made things even more confusing. He said different things about what happened to Rosemary's body. One minute he'd buried her in northwest New Jersey, then he'd say he tossed her in the Atlantic Ocean. Was he trying to mess with the investigation, or was it something, well, more sinister?
That's a good question, and honestly, it's all speculation. Maybe he was trying to mislead investigators, throw them off his trail. But it could also be a sign of, a narcissistic personality, a need to control everything, even the story of his crimes.
So Zarinsky's in prison for Rosemary Calandriello's murder, but his story, it doesn't end there. And neither does the list of possible victims. Now we have to jump ahead to 2001 when Zarinsky ends up back in court, this time facing charges for the 1958 murder of a police officer, Charles Bernowski in Rahway. This one sounds like something straight out of a movie. Tell us more about this case.
Okay, picture this. Officer Bernowski stumbles upon a burglary happening at a car dealership. He ends up in a shootout with the suspects, and tragically, he's killed. But he managed to wound both of the burglars as they ran away. And that's where Zarinsky comes in.
Hold on. If Bernowski was shot during a burglary, how did they connect Zarinsky to it decades later?
Decades, yeah. Over 40 years passed before a fingerprint finally tied Zarinsky's cousin, Theodore Schiffer, to the scene. Schiffer did time for the burglary, but the murder charge is a different story. What really complicated things was the testimony of Zarinsky's own sister, Judith Sapsa.
Oh yeah, his sister's testimony was a shocker.
Absolutely. Sapsa claims that she and her mother helped take bullets out of Zarinsky and Schiffer on the night of the murder. And here's the unbelievable part. She even said she heard Zarinsky admit to it, saying, "Daddy and I shot a cop."
So with his own family saying he did it, how did Zarinsky get away with this one?
You'd think that would be the end, right? But the defense did a good job of making people question whether Sapsa and Schiffer were telling the truth.
What do you mean? Were they not reliable witnesses?
Well, there were inconsistencies in their stories. For example, when Sapsa came forward, she was being investigated for embezzling money from Zarinsky.
Oh, wow.
So the defense said she might have had reasons to lie and blame her brother. And Schiffer, well, he already served time for the burglary, so they said maybe he was trying to pin the murder on Zarinsky.
So the jury had to decide, were these family members seeking justice, or were they trying to protect themselves? And in the end, they couldn't convict Zarinsky just based on their word. It's amazing how the legal system, even though it aims for justice, can sometimes have such unexpected outcomes.
Right.
It really is.
It shows that the idea of innocent until proven guilty is really important. Even with what seemed like strong testimony, there was enough doubt to prevent a conviction. But remember, even though he was acquitted in this case, Zarinsky was still in prison for Rosemary Calandriello's murder. And that's when another twist happens.
Okay, this is where it gets even more interesting. What happened next?
In 2008, while he was still in prison, Zarinsky was indicted for another murder, the 1968 killing of 13-year-old Jane DeRua, and this time it was DNA evidence that linked him to the crime.
So even after all those years, technology caught up with him. But sadly, he died in prison from pulmonary fibrosis before he could stand trial for this one.
That's right. He died in 2008 at 68 years old, leaving behind a ton of unanswered questions and a shadow of suspicion that stretches over decades and so many victims.
But here's the thing. We've only scratched the surface of this story. Remember, Zarinsky claimed he could solve up to 10 murders. So the big question is, how many secrets did he take to his grave?
It's scary to think about. Zarinsky was also the main suspect in the murders of several other young women: Linda Balabanow, Doreen Carlucci, Joanne Delardo, and Ann Logan. Their families, just like the families of his other possible victims, are left with the horrible feeling of not knowing what really happened.
It's a stark reminder that justice can be incredibly difficult to achieve, especially with a suspect as cunning and elusive as Robert Zarinsky. But there's more to come. We're going to dig deeper into the specifics, look at the evidence, and try to unravel this complicated and truly disturbing case. Stick with us as we continue this deep dive into the dark world of Robert Zarinsky. We're back, and we're continuing to piece together this complex story of Robert Zarinsky. You know, with a case like this, so many possible victims, so many unanswered questions, it's hard to know where to start. But before we go further into Zarinsky's crimes, I want to go back to something you said earlier. He was the first person in New Jersey convicted of murder without a body. That's a huge obstacle to overcome in court, right?
Absolutely. The 1975 conviction for Rosemary Calandriello's murder, it was groundbreaking. It really shows how complicated forensic investigations are and how legal precedent works. Back then, getting a murder conviction without a body, well, it was practically unheard of. It challenged the whole idea of what's enough evidence to prove someone's guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
You know, it's easy to get caught up in the legal side of things, but we can't forget the human cost. Rosemary's family lived for decades not knowing what happened to her with no closure. Can you imagine the emotional toll that must have taken?
It's just heartbreaking. And remember, this was before DNA testing was widely used. The Calandriello family was left with so many unanswered questions. Where was her body? What were her last moments like? Did she suffer? So many families of missing persons carry that weight, that constant uncertainty, and the inability to truly grieve.
And it's even worse because Zarinsky, even after he was convicted, kept messing with investigators and the families. He gave all these conflicting stories about what happened to Rosemary's body. Was that just his way of trying to control things from prison, some kind of twisted game?
It's possible. Zarinsky was known for being manipulative and narcissistic. He seemed to enjoy the attention his crimes got, the fear he caused. It's not uncommon for serial killers to get a sense of power from the chaos they create. They want to be remembered. They want to leave their mark on the world, even if it's a mark of darkness and despair.
And speaking of darkness, let's talk about one of Zarinsky's other suspected victims, Linda Balabanow. Unlike Rosemary, they found Linda's body, but her murder is still unsolved. What can you tell us about her case? Why was Zarinsky the prime suspect?
Linda Balabanow was only 17 when she disappeared from Union, New Jersey in 1969. A few weeks later, they found her body in the woods. She had been strangled. Now, there was no direct evidence linking Zarinsky to Linda's murder, but the circumstances, how she disappeared, and the fact that she fit the profile of his other possible victims, well, it made him a person of interest right away.
So what was it about Linda's case that made investigators think of Zarinsky? Were there similarities to Rosemary Calandriello's disappearance or to other unsolved murders in the area?
There were several striking similarities. First, both Linda and Rosemary were young women in their late teens. Second, they both disappeared from towns near where Zarinsky lived. And third, the time frame of their disappearances, it matched up with when Zarinsky was known to be active.
It's almost like he had a type, a specific kind of victim he targeted. That's something we see in a lot of serial killers, right? That tendency to prey on a certain type of person.
Exactly. Serial killers often have patterns in how they choose their victims. It might be their age, gender, how they look, even their job. These patterns, as disturbing as they can help investigators connect the dots between cases that seem unrelated.
So even though they never charged Zarinsky with Linda's murder, investigators strongly suspected he was involved. It makes you wonder, if Linda's case had happened when DNA testing was available, could they have built a stronger case against him?
It's definitely possible. DNA technology changed everything in forensic investigations. It's helped solve so many cold cases. But even without DNA evidence, the circumstances and the similarities to Zarinsky's other suspected crimes, well, it paints a pretty clear picture.
It's a haunting reminder that even if someone gets away with a crime, their past can come back to haunt them. And sometimes it's advances in technology that finally provide the missing pieces of the puzzle.
And that brings us to another turning point in Zarinsky's story, one that happened years after his death. In 2016, DNA evidence directly linked him to the 1965 murder of 18-year-old Mary Agnes Klinsky. This was a case that had gone cold for over 50 years.
This is the case where Mary Agnes was found near a park in Holmdel, right? Can you tell us more about her case and how the DNA breakthrough finally gave her family some closure?
Mary Agnes Klinsky was a bright young woman with her whole life ahead of her. She disappeared one evening in September of 1965. The next day, they found her body in the woods near a park. She had been beaten, raped, and strangled. It was a horrible crime that shocked the community.
It's hard to imagine the terror and grief her family must have gone through, to have someone so young taken so tragically. But after 50 years, they finally got some answers. How did that DNA breakthrough happen?
It shows how dedicated law enforcement is and how powerful forensic science can be. New DNA technology allowed investigators to re-examine evidence from the crime scene, and they were able to match a DNA profile to Robert Zarinsky, even though he had been dead for 8 years.
It's a bittersweet victory, isn't it? On one hand, it brought closure to Mary Agnes's family. They finally knew who killed their loved one. But on the other hand, it reminds us of all the other possible victims whose cases are still unsolved.
You're right, and that's what makes Zarinsky's case so disturbing. He died in prison, convicted of one murder, but suspected of so many more. And as time passes, the chance of solving those other cases gets smaller and smaller.
It's like his shadow still hangs over those unsolved murders, a constant reminder of unanswered questions and lingering doubts. And when he died, he took any remaining secrets with him, leaving behind pain and frustration for the families who are still searching for answers.
And that's what makes this deep dive so compelling. We're trying to solve a puzzle where a lot of the pieces are missing. We're dealing with the darkness that can exist in people and the constant search for justice, even when it seems impossible to find.
Well said. We've covered a lot, but there's still more to uncover. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll look closer at Robert Zarinsky's psychological profile. We'll try to understand what might have driven him to do these awful things. We'll try to understand the mind of a killer. Stay with us as we go further into the dark and twisted world of Robert Zarinsky. Okay, we're back, and we've been carefully putting together the pieces of Robert Zarinsky's story. We've looked at the crimes, the trials, the victims, but now in this last part of our deep dive, I want to focus on the man himself. What can we learn about Zarinsky's mind? His motivations. What led him down this really dark path?
It's the question that always comes up in cases like this, isn't it? We can trace what happened, the timeline of events, but trying to understand why, the root of such darkness, that's where things get really complicated.
Right. We talked before about Zarinsky's troubled childhood, his stays in psychiatric institutions. Are there any diagnoses or evaluations that might help us understand his psychology?
Unfortunately, a lot of that information is still sealed. But what we do know is that reports indicate he showed signs of antisocial personality disorder. This disorder is often associated with a disregard for social norms, a lack of empathy, and difficulty forming genuine emotional connections.
So if we're considering antisocial personality disorder as a possible diagnosis, would that fit with how calculated Zarinsky's crimes seem? This sense that he was always in control, orchestrating these horrific acts?
It's definitely a piece of the puzzle. People with antisocial personality disorder often act impulsively, recklessly, without thinking about the consequences. They don't feel remorse, and there's this drive for power and control. But it's important to remember this is just one part of a very complex psychological profile. We can't say for sure that this alone explains his actions.
It makes you think about what other factors might have contributed to Zarinsky's descent into violence. Do we know anything about his family life, his relationships? Could there have been things in his environment that played a role?
There's a lot of speculation, but solid evidence is hard to come by. Some experts have suggested that maybe he was exposed to violence or abuse as a child, and that could have been a factor. But it's crucial to avoid jumping to conclusions without strong evidence. Sadly, with Zarinsky gone, we may never have the complete picture.
It's like we're trying to solve a mystery, but half the pages of the book are missing, right? We can analyze what we have, look for patterns, but some questions might remain unanswered forever. But I think it's still important to explore these psychological complexities, even if we can't get definite answers.
I agree. When we examine these cases, when we delve into the psychology of individuals like Zarinsky, it helps us understand human behavior better. It forces us to confront the reality that even without clear motivations, evil can exist.
We've been talking about Zarinsky as this almost larger-than-life figure, this shadowy figure connected to so much pain. But in the end, he was a human being. He had the capacity for both good and evil. And I think that's the most unsettling takeaway for me. That potential for darkness exists in all of us. It's a sobering thought.
It is. And it reminds us how important it is to be vigilant, to nurture empathy and compassion in our own lives. But it also reminds us of the strength of the human spirit, the constant pursuit of justice and closure, even when faced with terrible tragedy.
That's what I find so inspiring about the families of Zarinsky's victims. Their determination to find answers, to find some peace, it's incredible. Their stories are a true testament to the power of hope and to never giving up on the search for truth.
I think that's a perfect point to end on. Zarinsky's case might always be wrapped in mystery, but the strength of those who were affected by his crimes, it shines a light in the darkness. It's a reminder that even when facing evil, compassion and the pursuit of justice can win in the end.
It's been a difficult journey exploring the life and alleged crimes of Robert Zarinsky. This deep dive has taken us through decades of unsolved mysteries, court battles, and the impact on so many lives. As we wrap up, I think it's important to remember that while Zarinsky is gone, the search for answers, for closure, and for a deeper understanding of the darkness that can live inside us, that search goes on. Thank you for joining us on this journey.